When an empath begins to mirror the very tactics once used against them, something profound takes place. The entire power dynamic starts to shift. For so long, the narcissist has thrived on the predictability of the empath's responses. They know the empath will overextend, forgive too quickly, or absorb the wounds silently in order to keep the peace. This reliability is the narcissist's greatest weapon. Because control only works when one can anticipate the other's compliance. But when the empath withdraws that compliance and begins to act with deliberate silence, with boundaries that are no longer flexible, the narcissist is left in unfamiliar territory. What once felt like certainty begins to feel like sand slipping through their fingers. The moment the empath withholds emotional supply, the narcissist senses a fracture in their system of dominance. It is not merely about losing someone's affection. It is about losing their anchor of power. For the narcissist, a control is a lifeline, a confirmation that their fragile sense of self still holds influence over another. When the empath no longer dances to that rhythm, the narcissist experiences the beginnings of destabilization. Their identity, which thrives on domination, starts to wobble under the weight of uncertainty. This power shift is not born out of malice on the empath's part. It emerges from necessity. The empath has been drained, exhausted by the endless cycle of give and take, where giving was demanded and taking was their only role. By turning to the same tools of silence and detachment, the empath is not sinking to the narcissist's level, but rising to reclaim autonomy. What was once used as a weapon against them now becomes a shield of protection. The narcissist feels this shift viscerally. Silence, once their method of punishment, now becomes their tormentor. The empath's withdrawal, once seen as weakness, is now revealed as strength. The predator discovers that their prey has teeth, and those teeth are not bared in cruelty, but in quiet defiance. It is the refusal to play the game that disarms the narcissist more than any confrontation ever could. Psychologically, this is the point where the empath steps out of the archetype of the victim and into the role of the sovereign individual. They no longer exist within the narcissist's narrative. They begin to author their own. In Jungian terms, one could say the shadow is being integrated. The empath is no longer only light, endlessly forgiving, endlessly giving. They have touched their own darkness, and instead of fearing it, they use it as a force of balance. This is not vengeance, but individuation. And in that moment of reclamation, the narcissist is confronted with their greatest fear: irrelevance. They cannot dominate what refuses to be dominated. They cannot manipulate what refuses to engage. The power has shifted, and it does not shift back easily. For the empath, this is the first taste of liberation. The realization that strength was never about serving another's ego, but about standing firmly in their own truth. The lesson is simple yet profound. The moment you stop feeding someone else's power over you, you discover the immense reservoir of power within yourself. When the empath begins to mirror the narcissist's tactics, the dynamic takes on a strange and unsettling quality, especially for the narcissist. For the first time, they are confronted with something they have spent their entire lives avoiding: a reflection of themselves. The narcissist thrives by projecting their flaws outward, by making others carry the weight of their insecurity, guilt, or shame. They manipulate so they never have to face their own emptiness. But when an empath uses the same behaviors, silence, withdrawal, emotional detachment, the narcissist sees their own strategies held up like a mirror, and what stares back unsettles them more than any direct confrontation ever could. This is where the empath's power quietly intensifies. Not because they are becoming what they despise, but because they are stripping away the narcissist's illusion. A tactic only works when the target does not recognize it. But when the empath, who once played along, suddenly uses those same maneuvers, the narcissist is robbed of the sense of superiority that once defined the relationship. The very tools that once built their facade now turn into a spotlight exposing its cracks. It is important to understand the psychology at play here. The narcissist does not live in truth. They live in performance. Their charm, their manipulation, their cold silences, all of it is designed to maintain control over others and, more importantly, over their own fragile self-image. But when those tactics are mirrored back, they no longer function as tools of dominance. They become distortions, revealing how shallow and predictable these methods truly are. The narcissist is left to experience their own game, as if it were turned against them. And that experience is deeply destabilizing. For the empath, this moment is transformative. By adopting these behaviors temporarily, they gain an insight into just how hollow and mechanical the narcissist tactics have always been. What once felt powerful in the hands of the abuser is revealed as nothing more than smoke and mirrors. This realization strengthens the empath, reminding them that they were never weak, only conditioned to respond. The mirror they hold up not only exposes the narcissist's patterns, but also awakens the empath to their own capacity for resilience and discernment. Philosophically, it is almost as if the empath becomes the alchemist, transmuting poison into medicine. By reflecting the narcissist's behaviors, they reveal the truth hidden beneath the mask, that domination is not strength and manipulation is not power. The narcissist, confronted with their own reflection, cannot escape the unease of seeing what they are without the usual supply to distract them. In that silence, they are forced, however briefly, to taste the emptiness they spend their lives concealing. And this is the paradox, The empath's use of the narcissist's tactics is not about becoming cruel, but about bringing to light the cruelty itself. It is the reflection that wounds the narcissist, not because the empath has harmed them, but because they have revealed what was always there. The greatest weapon against deception is truth. And nothing reveals truth more sharply than a mirror. One of the most unsettling experiences for the narcissist occurs when confusion begins to replace the sense of control they once held. Control is the foundation of their existence. It is the scaffolding that supports the fragile edifice of their identity. They move through life orchestrating dynamics where roles are clearly defined. They are the dominant, the superior, the one who dictates the rules of engagement. The empath, in their eyes, exists to affirm this dominance, to yield, to forgive, to provide an endless stream of validation. But once the empath disrupts this script, once they stop responding in predictable ways, the narcissist begins to lose their grip. The clarity they depend upon is replaced by uncertainty, and with uncertainty comes panic. The narcissist's strategies have always relied on cause and effect. If they withhold affection, the empath is supposed to chase them. If they deploy rage, the empath is supposed to calm them. If they gaslight, the empath is supposed to question their own reality. These mechanisms are only effective because they have been rehearsed into a routine. Yet when the empath no longer plays their part, when silence is met with silence, when rage is met with detachment, when manipulation is met with unyielding truth, the narcissist's certainty dissolves. They cannot calculate outcomes in a game where the rules have suddenly changed. This confusion is more than a temporary frustration. For the narcissist, it destabilizes the very foundation of their constructed self. They are not only losing control of the empath, but also losing control of the narrative that allows them to believe in their own superiority. They begin to wonder, why isn't this working? Why aren't they reacting? Why do I feel unsettled instead of powerful? This inner questioning, though often buried under rage or denial, is evidence of their deepest vulnerability. For the empath, this stage is crucial. It is where they begin to see, perhaps for the first time, how much of the narcissist's strength was only an illusion. What seemed like dominance was nothing more than a dependence on predictable outcomes. And when those outcomes are no longer guaranteed, the narcissist is revealed not as a powerful figure, but as someone deeply fragile, desperately clinging to a system that no longer functions. In a broader sense, this confusion is symbolic. It represents the collapse of an old order and the birth of a new one. It shows that control over others is never as secure as it appears. The narcissist believed they were the author of the story. But once the empath steps out of their role, the narrative falls apart. The script cannot continue without the cooperation of both characters, and when the empath chooses to stop playing their assigned part, the narcissist is left with silence, uncertainty, and fear. And here lies the truth worth remembering. Power is never real if it depends entirely on someone else's compliance. When the narcissist begins to realize that their usual strategies no longer work, the confusion that unsettles them quickly gives way to something far more volatile: rage. This rage is not simply the anger of someone being opposed. It is the eruption of a deeply fragile ego suddenly confronted with its own powerlessness. For the narcissist, control is oxygen. It sustains their sense of superiority and masks the emptiness within. When that oxygen is cut off, when the empath refuses to respond as expected, the narcissist feels as though they are suffocating. Rage, then, becomes their desperate gasp for air. This fury is often disproportionate to the situation. The empath may have simply chosen silence, may have calmly set a boundary, or may have withdrawn from the manipulative game. Yet to the narcissist, these acts are perceived as intolerable threats. Why? Because they expose the narcissist's illusion of dominance. Their authority depends on compliance, and when that compliance is withheld, they are forced to face a truth they cannot bear: that their control was never absolute, and their superiority was never real. At its core, narcissistic rage is not about the empath at all. It is about the narcissist's inner war with themselves. The silence they cannot break, the boundary they cannot cross, the manipulation that no longer works. All of these force them to feel the very emotions they spend their lives running from. Rejection, inadequacy, vulnerability. Rage becomes the mask that covers their shame, the outward explosion that conceals their inward collapse. It is easier for them to lash out than to sit in the discomfort of their own fragility. For the empath, this can be a dangerous stage because the narcissist's fury can manifest in unpredictable and destructive ways. Yet it is also a moment of profound revelation. The empath sees, often for the first time with absolute clarity, that the narcissist's strength was never strength at all. It was fragility disguised as power, insecurity cloaked in arrogance. The rage that seems so overpowering is in truth a cry of desperation, a signal that the narcissist facade is crumbling under pressure. Philosophically, this rage can be seen as the shadow breaking through the mask. The narcissist, who has always projected their darkness onto others, is now being forced to confront it directly. The empath's refusal to play the role of caretaker or victim becomes the mirror that reflects this darkness back to them. And though the narcissist may resist, deny, or explode, the truth remains: rage is not power. It is the death rattle of a collapsing illusion. What the empath must remember in this moment is that their silence, their boundary, their refusal to yield is not cruelty, but courage. It is the act of standing firm while the storm rages, knowing that the storm is not a sign of their weakness, but proof of the narcissist's unraveling. And here lies the lesson: the louder the rage, the clearer the truth, that real power is never found in domination, but in the quiet strength of self-possession. For the empath, reaching the point of using the narcissist's own tactics is never about becoming vindictive or cruel. It is not an attempt to play the same destructive game, but rather a necessary step toward liberation. The empath has spent so much of their life giving, forgiving, and absorbing the storms of others that they often forget their own right to stand firm. When they begin to mirror the narcissist, through silence, through boundaries, through emotional detachment, they are not abandoning their true nature. They are reclaiming it. They are declaring, without words, that their worth is no longer up for negotiation. This realization is profound because it marks the end of an old identity. The empath is no longer defined by the role of caretaker or rescuer, the one who exists to soften the blows of another's insecurity. Instead, they begin to embody a different form of strength, one that does not bend endlessly for the sake of peace. They discover that compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction, and that true empathy includes empathy for oneself. This shift is not about hardness, but about balance. The recognition that one cannot pour endlessly from an empty cup. When the empath finally holds their ground, the weight of years of manipulation begins to fall away. There is a lightness in realizing that they no longer have to explain themselves, no longer have to justify their pain, no longer have to chase after someone who thrives on being uncatchable. The silence they once feared becomes their ally. The boundary they once avoided becomes their sanctuary. The withdrawal they once thought was weakness reveals itself as clarity. In this newfound liberation, the empath also begins to see the narcissist differently. No longer through the lens of longing or guilt, but through the clarity of truth. They recognize that the narcissist's power was always dependent on their willingness to submit. And once that willingness is gone, the narcissist's authority dissolves. This is not triumph in the sense of defeating an enemy, but victory in the sense of finally choosing oneself. Carl Jung often spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating both light and shadow. This is precisely what happens when the empath uses the narcissist's tactics with awareness. They are not abandoning their essence of kindness, but they are integrating the shadow of firmness, even defiance, into their being. They learn that love without strength is exploitation, and strength without love is tyranny. To embody both is to step into wholeness. This stage of liberation is where the empath begins to live, not as a reaction to someone else's demands, but as a full expression of their own truth. They stop existing in the narcissist's story and start writing their own. And the lesson here is strikingly clear. Liberation begins the moment you realize that choosing yourself is not selfishness. It is the highest form of self-respect. When the empath finally refuses to play the role assigned to them, when they begin to mirror the tactics once used against them, the entire dynamic enters a stage of transformation. It is not only the empath who changes, the narcissist, too, is forced to confront the consequences of their own strategies. What once seemed like an eternal cycle of dominance and submission now collapses under its own weight, and in that collapse, both sides are transformed, though in profoundly different ways. For the empath, this transformation is a rebirth. They begin to realize that their pain was not in vain, that every wound, every manipulation, every cycle of giving and being drained has shaped a deeper awareness within them. By stepping out of the narcissist's narrative, they no longer see themselves as the perpetual victim. They see themselves as resilient, capable of standing firm, capable of saying no without guilt. This is the point where the empath integrates what Jung would call the shadow. The parts of themselves they once disowned: anger, defiance, even withdrawal. They no longer fear these aspects, but embrace them as essential to their wholeness. In doing so, they move closer to individuation, that process of becoming complete within oneself. The narcissist, on the other hand, faces a very different kind of transformation. Without the empath's compliance, without the steady supply of validation, their facade begins to fracture. They are confronted with the reality that their tactics are not omnipotent, that their power evaporates the moment the other refuses to engage. This is perhaps the one truth the narcissist fears most, that their control is an illusion, dependent entirely on the participation of another. When that participation ends, they are left to face the emptiness within, the very void they have spent their life avoiding. This does not mean the narcissist suddenly awakens to self-awareness or begins to change. More often than not, they retreat into denial or seek new sources of supply. But whether they acknowledge it or not, the mirror has been held up. For a brief moment, they glimpse the fragility of their construct, and that glimpse is enough to disturb the foundation of their illusion. The empath, however, emerges with something far greater than survival. They gain wisdom. They learn that strength and compassion are not opposites, but complements. They discover that setting boundaries is not cruelty, but love directed inward. They understand that liberation is not achieved by fighting to change the narcissist, but by choosing to transform themselves. This final stage is not just the end of a toxic dynamic, it is the beginning of a new self. The empath rises from the ashes of manipulation with a deeper sense of clarity, no longer chained to the roles imposed upon them. They learn that transformation is not about defeating another, but about awakening to their own sovereignty. And so the truth reveals itself in the simplest of ways. The empath's greatest victory is not in conquering the narcissist, but in reclaiming themselves.